Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 4 game from the Grenke Chess Open. Now, if you watched the round 3 video, you know that I won a very interesting, long-ish maneuvering game against an untethered player by the name of Rudy Horstman. And in this one, I was hoping to keep the continuity going because I'd now won 2 in a row after my first round draw. Unfortunately, I was actually pared down a third game in a row, and I think it was actually just because there were so many players in this open section that are around 2,300 that, having that draw in the first round actually did kind of set me back quite a bit, and I need to win several games to get back to the top. So in this one, I actually was playing another player in the 2,300 range. This time it was actually a young teenager by the name of Alexander Suvorov. And also happened to be the 4th German in a row I played from 4 rounds. So I'd only played Germans thus far. So anyways, I was black in this one. And without further ado, let's get into it. So white opened with d4. I played d5. And bishop f4 is played. And bishop f4 pretty much introduces the London system. The idea in a lot of these structures is to try and control the e5 square with your pieces, with the knight on f3, the bishop on e5, on f4 controlling e5, and then to play e3 and just basically have no bad pieces in a comfortable game. And in recent years, it's been an incredibly popular line, in part because Carlsen and a lot of the top players started to use it as a way to get away from theory. But in actual fact, it's been played so often now that now there's even theory for the London system. So go figure. I've actually faced the London system quite a bit, and there are different ways I've responded against it. But there was one of my more recent memories with the London system when this game had been played was actually from a year prior in 2018, where I actually needed a win with black in the last round to secure my first GM norm, and I actually managed to seal the deal, and I won a really remarkable game in less than 30 moves on the black side of the London. And, I thought, maybe I can consider using that system again. And I think I actually went for it here. So after knight f6, e3, this is normal, e6, and now knight d2. This is a little bit unique move order. Sometimes people start with knight f3 first. It is wise if you're a London player not to rush with c3. That would require a whole nother video just to explain that, but maybe you could just take my word for it now that actually delaying C2, C3 is actually a really good thing in many cases. And I went for bishop d6. And this line of bishop d6 is actually quite solid. The point is you just challenge the bishop on this diagonal. So instead of normally the bishop goes to e7, it's a little more passive. Here it's extremely active. So bishop g3 is played. That's something that most of the London players play because they don't mind bishop takes bishop takes g3, h takes g3 to open up the h file. So a lot of times they drop that back. And now I castled, and white went bishop d3. And in this case, I don't want to rush to play bishop takes g3 because the rook is bearing down on h7. So I want to be a little bit patient with that. And there are a few ways you could be patient. You can consider playing b6 and then playing for c5. You can maybe even play queen e7 and develop this way. But I thought that c5 is really where my pawn break is going to go, so I thought there's no need in waiting for it, and I went for c5. And this nearly provokes a crisis because right now white has to decide what they're going to do. Are they going to take on c5 or are they going to keep tension? And that question is something that the white player pretty much has to wrestle with. Now, in most cases, they tend to want to keep tension because if they take on c5, not bishop takes d6, d takes c5, it's not that they ruin their pawn structure because they haven't ruined their pawn structure or anything by taking, but they don't have as firm a grip on the e5 square now that the pawn is gone. So a lot of times they try to hold fast, and my opponent did that by playing c3, which is a fairly automatic London system move. That's one of the other things actually against the London system that's important to keep in mind is a lot of time the white players kind of playing on autopilot. So sometimes you could catch them with an idea that, they didn't quite calculate or consider too seriously because they play the first 6 to 8 moves on autopilot, getting the bishop outside the chain, setting up this triangle of pawns, putting the bishop on d3, then knight on f3, and knight on d2. That's like the London special right there. So anyways, after c3, I now went queen c7, and this is actually the beginning of the line that I'd actually played in 2018 against in the must-win game where I needed a win in the last round to get my first GM norm. And the idea with queen c7 is actually you're taking some time to move your queen and control the e5 square, and then the other plan is to go knight b d7. And the point is, once you have the knight on d7, the bishop on d6, and the queen on c7, you actually have 3 pieces covering e5, which makes White's control over the e5 square less stable, because, you know, if they only have 3 pieces controlling e5 and you have 3 pieces controlling e5, you know, White can't just occupy, you know, a piece there, because then they only have 2 pieces controlling that square. So the point is, that if the knight gets to d7, White can no longer just drop a knight in on e5 and let it stay there, because it would just hang a pawn. So I always think this system is a little bit interesting, because in most Londons, White dominates that square, and this one they really don't, and they have to play a little bit differently to get an advantage. So I'm not going to be super specific about how White should be playing this structure, because I may go for the system again, and I do have some opinions about this. But I will say that what White did in this game did not meet the mark. So he started with knight gf3, which is reasonable, trying to control the e5 square. But now I go knight bd7, and the issue is, again, now this knight can't just come in as like usual, and it actually means that my pieces are actually controlling e5, and I can consider playing the e5 thrust myself. So this gives me, you know, considerable leverage in the middle. The flip side is, now if White wants to go d takes c5, I actually will take with the knight, because it actually hits the bishop on d3, and at the same time it also covers the e4 square well. So in this case, actually, Black would be slightly better, in my opinion. So anyways, after knight bd7, White castled, and this was a slightly new position for me, because in the game in 2018, I think it was against international master Denis Shmelov, he played queen e2 against me, and he kept his rook on the h file for a bit longer, because he wanted me to take on g3 and open the line for his rook. But now after castling, you know, I can consider already taking on g3. And this was the question, well, should I take on g3 or should I do something else? I decided to take. I thought that made sense to, you know, trade that bishop. And after h takes g3, now I went for, I have a few moves, actually. I can consider going b6 or, you know, rook d8. But I decided to be very direct and go for e5. e5 is actually not the most precise move, because it actually allows White to liquidate in a fairly interesting way. But if I wanted to keep more pieces or more tension in the position, a move like b6 could have been considered. The point being that I put my bishop on b7, and I still have this e5 break whenever I want, but I can get all my pieces in the game and my rook's connected before I go in for that break. I thought e5 was a reasonable move, but it turned out, and it was, but it turned out that White does have a liquidating option. And what happened was, after e5, I'm threatening e4, and so White has to resolve this tension in the center. And he did so by playing e4. And e4 was a move I actually did not take too seriously. I saw it was an option, but I didn't realize that it was as good as it was. And the point is that what I was angling for was a scenario where he plays d takes c5. And after d takes, I have knight takes e5. And if he takes again, and let's say plays knight f3, I thought in the position after queen e7 that White would be a little bit better, because I have good control over the e4 square. And so the only reasonable break in this position is actually c4 for White. But I figured that if in this structure after d takes e4, bishop takes e4, I have a queenside pawn majority, which would occur after like a 3-on-2 scenario here. And, you know, White's majority, the 4-on-3 on the king side, is not as easy to mobilize, in particular because I have such great control over the e4 square. So I thought these positions would be slightly better for me. So I thought, okay, this whole scenario with e5, if we were able to trade a few minor pieces and then I dart my queen back to e7, I'm in great shape. But it turns out that this e4 move just says, you know what, I can keep the tension in the middle and then now take away the e4 move from me and at the same time start to liquidate. And the issue in my position is with the bishop on c8, I'm not exactly ready to, open up the game fully because, essentially not all my pieces are in the right squares yet. You could see if this type of setup was on the board and my bishop was on b7 already, it would be, very good for black because I could take on a4 and, I would be protecting that pawn with two pieces and he wouldn't be able to take back. But with my bishop on c8 and my knight in the way of that, it changes things. So that's kind of the one flaw of rushing with e5. So in this position, I had to figure out, what was I going to do? Was I going to take on e4? Was I going to take on d4? It was kind of clear to me that I needed to do something because I thought that white's next move was going to be e takes d5, and I didn't really want to take with the knight here because it felt a little bit loose. So I started with e takes d4 like this. And the point is that if e takes d5 now, I have this intermediate move d takes c3, and I thought that wins a pawn. Because now after b takes d3, this pawn is hanging, and I didn't think the Greek gift sacrifices should work at this present moment. After takes, if check, he can get a queen to h5, yeah, but my knight can just pop back to f6, and there's no checkmate. So I just win a pawn here if he plays e takes d5. So after e takes d5, he went c takes d4. And now here's another kind of critical position because there's this annoying pawn tension here, right? And actually white, in some lines, is actually threatening e5, dislodging my knight from the king side. And you can see I don't have a really great square to go to because this one's on d7, and I can't go to e4 because I'd lose a pawn, and g4 and h5 are just incredibly awkward. So I decided to play d takes e4 to actually get rid of that pawn, and that forces more liquidation. Instead, a better move would have been c4, or another more dynamic, interesting move at least. And the point is that when the bishop darts back, now I take on e4, and after knight f6, we have a scenario where we both have three pawns on the queen side, but the argument is that this d pawn might be a little bit weaker than the c4 pawn because the d pawn can't really be supported by anything, whereas the c4 pawn can ultimately be supported by the b pawn eventually. And so I actually have two pawn islands and white has three, and I think this might give white a slight advantage. Black a slight advantage. Additionally, this knight might be able to go to d5, blockade the pawn quite nicely, and it seems like black has some good squares for his pieces. So this was maybe a more testing way to challenge my young opponent. So instead of doing that, I took, and after d takes e4, knight takes e4, I played c takes d4. And the reason I did this is because I wanted to keep this tension here instead of resolving it right away. I thought that if I took on e4 right away, after knight f6, I thought that white had a few good options, but one of them that I wasn't super comfortable with was bishop c2. And I thought the bishop coming to b3 would be on a really nice diagonal here. So I thought I wouldn't take on e4 right away and at least do this. After c takes d4, knight takes d4 is played. And now I have another kind of critical position because it would appear that white's actually closer to connecting the rooks. And now that this knight is in the center on d4, I was a little bit concerned about knight f5 at some point. Because the knight on f5, if you've seen any Kasparov games, knight on f5 is a very, very menacing attacking piece, and I just didn't want to tolerate that. So actually, I had a little bit of a change of heart here, and I actually thought maybe it was time to liquidate with knight takes d4, knight takes e4, and then knight f6 to kind of cover that up and cover the f5 square with my bishop. But then I decided to change my mind, and I thought maybe I can stop the knight coming to f5 another way. And I decided to go queen e5. And the point is that now I'm actually challenging this knight on d4, and f5 isn't a possibility. So knight takes f6 was played with check, and I was kind of cool with this because now he's basically helping me develop a little bit after I recapture. But then it kind of dawned on me that if I play knight takes f6, after rook e1, I can't actually take this knight on d4 because after queen takes d4, there's bishop takes h7 and my queen hangs. So I wasn't actually entirely confident that taking with the knight would be the best thing to do, even though it appears to be the most natural. And I also didn't want my queen to be kind of hassled around. Like, if I go to c5, now there's rook c1 as an option. And it just seemed like I'm getting kicked around a little bit. So instead of doing that, I decided to play queen takes f6 just to kind of be out of that line of fire of a rook e1 with tempo. And the other thing about queen takes f6 is my queen is 2 diagonals away from the knight, which means that it can't be harassed for 3 moves. So I thought, the queen was actually fairly secure here. And I actually clear the way for my knight to come to e5 with tempo to challenge this bishop on d3. So I thought, even though the pawns are liquidated here, I at least could, play a few moves with tempo and maybe, get some initiative on the d file with my rooks. White actually went queen h5, and this was a bit of a surprise to me because it seemed like this checkmate threat could be parried pretty easily. And, actually then I started to realize what his plan was. I think his argument was, well, if I'm able to trade queens and my rooks are connected and I'm first to the files, maybe I should be better. Maybe white should be better. But I had a different opinion. So I actually played g6 just to cover that queen takes h7 mate. And then queen h4 is played, which is actually the only move to, protect the knight besides going queen d1 back. And I saw his point was maybe he just wanted to trade queens and get a position where, it's relatively safe and everything's kind of liquidated, and maybe he'd be first to the file with his rooks, or maybe he'd just be, the game would fizzle out and he'd be happy to take a draw. I was not particularly enthusiastic about these outcomes, and I actually thought here about, ways to maybe keep the queens on the board and, maybe avoid the queen trade. Like I even considered a move like queen g7 for a second. But, after a moment, and you merely have to see a move like rook e1 to understand that this is way too risky to go in for something like this. It just doesn't make sense to try to keep the queens on the board here because white is actually getting a little bit too active for my taste. So because of that, I decided to just keep developing, and I went rook d8. And the point is that I'm acknowledging that the queens can come off the board, but, with my rook on the d file, maybe I challenge these minor pieces. And in fact, he can't take right away because of that particular outcome. So rook d1 was played first because, again, if you play queen takes f6, knight takes f6, white loses a piece. So rook d1 deals with that. And now I went queen takes h4 because I thought I could not improve my position anymore. I need my rooks to be connected. And after g takes h4, I went knight c5. And pretty much before us now, we have a position that's fairly close to equal. Again, materials level, both sides have one rook on a file right now. White's rooks are already connected. But I actually still had, visions of winning this game, and I wasn't thinking draw here at all because, two things were important to me here. One is that, the knight on d4 is not very secure, and minor pieces, especially knights, need anchors in the center, usually with pawns. So as long as the knights didn't have anchors in the center, I thought it'd be a question of, who could activate their minor pieces in better posts. Separately, I thought that my king's position was quite good, and particularly my pawn structure on the king side, to restrict the light-squared bishop. So as long as the light-squared bishop stayed on this diagonal, it seemed to me that it wasn't really going to be doing very much, and that my king was relatively secure, and I could play on the queen side. Lastly, I did love my knight on c5 because, again, I'm hitting d3 already, but I saw some scenarios where I might be able to kind of go to a4, maybe anchor that knight with b6. So I still just thought there was a lot of game to go. After knight c5, white went bishop c2, I guess trying to keep that bishop. That's a reasonable choice. I might have considered snapping it off, honestly. And of course, he also had to take care of the knight on d4, so it makes a lot of sense to back that up. I went bishop d7, just developing my bishop. The bishop d7 move looks extremely modest because, it's just moving one square. But at the end of the day, there were no better squares to go to. I mean, e6 and f5 would have just been taken by the knight. And, g4 would have just been targeted with f3. And so bishop d7 was the only square where it was pretty secure. And the benefit of bishop d7 also is that it dominates the knight squares going forward. So you can see this bishop does a great job of controlling the light squares that the knight can fan out to. So after bishop d7, white went rook ac1. That's a reasonable move, trying to get another rook to the file. And now I went rook ac8. And again, there's nothing really special here yet, but we're both kind of just mobilizing our forces. And I thought my knight on c5, my bishop on d7, were doing important jobs right now. My knight was controlling central squares, and my bishop was preventing the white knight from moving forward. So I thought I was okay here. White now went b3, and this was a move I was extremely happy to see. On the one hand, it's logical because it stops me from going knight a4, which was an idea. Note that now that my bishop on d7 and my rooks are connected, I'm kind of ready to go forward a little bit, and knight a4 does target b2. And so let's say you play a move like g3, which is not so great. After knight a4, if he doesn't want to give up the bishop and wants to go b3, then I have knight c3, and this is be a problem for white, because now I'm actually hitting the a2 pawn and the d1 rook, and you can see how my knight is seriously encroaching on the white position. So I understand why b3 was played to kind of restrict that knight, but the flip side of it is that now this bishop on c2, which we said already lacks some scope on this diagonal, now is not going to have any prospects on b3 for the near future. So this bishop is already kind of a problem piece, and it's looking more like a pawn than a bishop. So I was thrilled to see that. And after b3, I decided to play a5. And the point here was to kind of fix these pawns on light squares, prevent b4, and consider maybe also just continuing to support my knight on c5. There might be a scenario where I go b6 as well to sort of position my pawns on dark squares away from his light squared bishop and just to control the file. So I thought a5 was a nice move to kind of, put the screws on, and now the squeeze was on. I was trying to squeeze the position for all it's worth, even though I don't really have an advantage here because I think my minor pieces are slightly better. So anyways, white now went a3, I think kind of acknowledging that maybe this dark square bind was not something you want to allow. And I decided to play b6 anyway. Point being is that now my knight is protected here. My rook could potentially go elsewhere. And I also had a plan of maybe considering bishop e8 and doubling rooks on the d file to kind of get at the d4 knight. But you can see again, this bishop on c2 is just a fat pawn right now, and it's very important that white tries to do something to activate it. After b6, white went b4, and I understand that he wanted to dislodge the knight. It makes some sense. Note that if the knight on d4 moves away, let's say knight e2, all of a sudden I have a move like bishop e6, and you can see now my bishop has an excellent diagonal to work with, and my knight is also pressuring b3, and white is in a pretty good spot. So anyways, after b4, I took on b4, a takes b4, and then went knight a6. And I was really happy that he's pushing his pawns because it created targets for me. So what I was eyeing now was the b4 pawn as a target, and these dark squares are a little bit weakened because of the push. So I thought that now maybe I could infiltrate on c4 or c3 later. Another huge point of me having this light squared structure like this on the king side is that there are no kamikaze discoveries with bishop takes h7 because there's no check. So very important how I set up my pawns on the king side. So after knight a4, white went rook b1, and another move I was kind of happy to see because it's passive. This rook is now not on an open file. It's just guarding a b4. It's purely defensive. And now the knight on d4 is actually tied to c2. So, all is pretty good right now. After rook b1, I went bishop e8. And now for the first time, white has real threats. Basically, I'm actually threatening rook takes d4. And after rook takes d4, there's rook takes d2. And I'm actually winning two pieces for the rook. So already here you can see that there are actually some ideas in the position that make it a little dangerous. And you can just see there's a little less stability in white's forces than in black's forces. After bishop e8, white went for bishop d3. And my knight was hit, so I decided to do something about it. I don't want to take on d4 here and trade because, after rook takes d4, bishop takes a6, my rook on c8 is hanging, and I thought this kind of liquidation would not work out for me, even though h4 is temporarily hanging. So instead, I decided to play knight c7, redeploying it. And I actually had dreams of maybe the knight coming to c3 at some point. But again, you can see his pieces are hanging, and this is not so bad for me. White now went bishop e4, I think, to stop that knight d5 idea. Because, again, my knight comes to d5, knight c3, I'm in pretty good shape. I decided to go bishop a4 now, which is a really nice move on the diagonal, taking advantage of the fact that this bishop has left the c2 square. And I thought it was a nice tempo gainer because it now kind of asks White the question, well, do you want to split your rook? Do you want to split your rooks? Do you want to have rooks that aren't connected and not coordinated? White decided to play knight c6, and this was an interesting move because it basically indirectly defends the rook on d1, because if I take on d1 now, there's actually knight e7 check and my rook is hanging. And on the flip side, I don't want to play bishop takes c6 because if I do that, he has the bishop and the better minor piece, in my opinion. So instead of allowing knight e7 and trading and going for some liquidation, I decided to just step away and went rook d8, rook d e8. And again, you can see now I'm attacking the bishop on e4, and my bishop on a4 is attacking the bishop on the knight on c6. And you can see White still has loose pieces, and the rook on d1 is hanging. So all of a sudden, White just has a lack of coordination in the setup. The rook now went to e1, and that does manage to protect everything. But now I actually am given the opportunity to potentially get two pieces for the rook. And I thought for a few minutes, and I had a decision to make. Do I go rook takes e4 and bishop takes c6 or not? Why don't you pause the video and think about it and decide for yourself whether you would go for the two pieces for the rook. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what's what in the position. I actually gave it a hard consideration, but I decided, believe it or not to play rook takes e4. And the reason for that is after rook takes e4, bishop takes c6, I did not believe the position after rook c4 could be won. The reason is because now this other rook on the b file is coming to c1, and I just thought that, I'm kind of tied up, and it would be very difficult to win this position. Black, the computer does give black an advantage close to -1, but I just did not see a good way to untangle. One sample line would be knight b5, rook bc1, and then knight a7, which does cover the c8 rook and the c6 bishop. But the issue is now that after b5, bishop d7, and then rook c7, you actually have a scenario where I actually will wind up losing my b pawn. And we'll trade the pawn, sure, but this type of position where there's a 3-on-3 on the same side of the board, I didn't think the knight and the bishop were enough to beat off the rook, or just beat the rook, basically. So I just was not confident this was a win. It turns out there isn't one, so I just didn't want to oversimplify things in a moment where my opponent was actually in some time trouble, and I was hoping to loosen the screws some more. So instead of taking on e4, I actually just decided to play knight e6. And now I'm asking White another question. What to do with the knight? How are you going to defend this knight now? Now maybe even consider knight f4 might be an idea, or even knight d4 if the knight on c6 moves. And I think, again, in the past 5 to 6 moves, you could kind of see scenarios where every single move, White is being forced to make very important decisions. And I was happy with this because I thought the more decisions that White had to make, the better chance I would be able to sort of, crash through. White now went rook bc1, defending this knight on c6, but I believe this was a mistake. And the computer does as well. Instead, a better move would have been b5. But you could see how this would be a very, very difficult move to play because all of a sudden you're giving this lovely c5 square to the knight. And this bishop might, be able to just eye this b5 pawn and win it at some point. So the line can continue knight c5, bishop d5, and king f8 guarding against this knight e7 fork. And again, you could just see that all of black's pieces are protected and coordinated for the most part. And white is still just lacks a little bit of control and solidity. The rook is tied to the b5 pawn. This bishop is unprotected. This knight is kind of out of play. Black would still be a little bit better. So instead of that, he decided to play rook bc1, but it doesn't totally change the story. And I was thinking here, I would love to double my rooks and actually put more pressure on the c1 rook. So I decided to play king g7. And king g7 is a very, very nice prophylactic move. The point is that I want to get my king out of knight e7 discovery checks, because now if I played a move like h5, for instance, that'd be a huge blunder because of knight e7. And note that after rook takes e7, rook takes c8, white would win an exchange. So I basically step out of the way of any checks with knight e7. Also step out of the way of rook takes e8 checks with tempo, hitting my rook. And in the meantime, white has to make another move and is kind of unsure of what my plan is, which is ultimately going to be to try to double. So I was a little bit of prophylaxis before I go in for my ultimate plan, which is something that I thought was a really nice finesse. White now went for g3. And believe it or not, g3 turns out to be a losing move. A losing move. I could not believe that in this position where the material is equal, it doesn't seem like there's any attack on either king, that g3 is actually a losing move. But it all comes down to the coordination. And all of a sudden, g3 and the g3 square weakens the f3 square a little bit. And his pieces just aren't quite secure. And after the simple rook c7, all of a sudden, it's very difficult to meet this rook ec8 idea, which hits the knight, pins the knight to the rook on c1, and it doesn't seem like there's any good way to reinforce that piece. Now, instead of g3, a better move would have been knight a7 to just relieve the pin right away. But even here, black has an advantage and white has some problems because I could take on c1 and then play rook d8, and I'm threatening rook d4. There's all types of stuff on the fourth rank that's hanging. And then knight on a7 is, again, out of play and has not found that anchor, that outpost where it could be secure because, again, there haven't been any pawns in the middle to give it that support. So quite remarkable. But instead, after g3 and rook c7, white has no moves. No moves, amazingly. And actually, when I played this, I didn't realize that white was losing. I thought I had some pressure after rook ec8, but I did not realize that white was losing. Let's look at some options. If white goes, let's say, knight e5, well, that doesn't work because after rook takes c1, there's this issue on the e-file of hanging pieces, and I can actually go knight d4. And this totally exacerbates the problem because in addition to there being hanging pieces now, there's also knight e2 check, which is a devastating threat. So this just doesn't work. Let's try something else. If rook e d1, I guess maybe trying to, eye a file or something like that. Well, this doesn't work actually because I can actually take on d1. But another move even better than that is rook e8, and this piece is going to be lost. So after rook d6, I have knight d8, and again, there's no way to reinforce this knight on c6 anymore. So all of a sudden, white is totally lacking coordination, and black managed to coordinate right at the right moment, and it's just a losing position. White, after rook c7, managed to play rook e3, trying to, I think, double on the c-file and still protect the bishop on e4. And I just went knight d4 now, and this move is winning because in addition to threatening the c6 knight now, the rook on e3 is kind of frozen because the bishop on e4 would be hanging. So if rook ec3, I have rook takes e4, and if knight takes d4, I don't recapture on d4 first. I go rook takes rook takes c3, and after rook takes, you can see that black is up a piece. So knight d4 kind of seals the deal, unfortunately, for white's pieces because there's just too many things that are loose in this position. White now went bishop d3, trying to kind of confuse me a little bit in time trouble. Note my e8 rook is hanging, so I can't take the knight on c6 right away, but this does not save him. I went rook takes c6 with like this way, and this actually does work. I could also have gone rook takes e3, and that also would have won the game, and then rook takes d6, but I thought this way was a little bit cleaner, because now after rook takes d6, if rook takes e8 check, or excuse me, not check, after rook takes e8, I'm playing rook takes c1 check, and I also pick up the rook on e8 because my bishop's on a4. And on the flip side, if rook takes c6, I have bishop takes c6, and I'm again covering my e8 rook. So everything is actually protected because of the bishop on a4. After rook takes c6, white played rook a1, challenging this bishop, and it's just kind of a last attempt, because if I move my bishop away now, you can see my rook on e8 is hanging. And so I think he thought that after rook takes e3, after f takes e3, my knight on d4 and my bishop on a4 would be hanging. But this can be pretty easily parried after rook e3, f e3, and then there are actually multiple ways to deal with this. One way is I can actually go bishop c2 and just trade these bishops, and note that if he takes on d4, I could just take here. But the way that I played, which is also quite simple and easy, is knight f3 check. And the point is the king has to move, and then I have knight e5, very important, which hits the bishop with tempo and ensures that I recover my piece. Or I should say, keeps the piece up that I have. White tried one more move, bishop e4, which does hit my rook on c6, but I had calculated this one and played rook c4. And this was the point, is that the king can't step up to e3 because the knight is covering the square. And now the rook is hitting e4, and, you know, there's just no way to recover the piece and save your own. So in this position on move 38, I believe, white resigned. I think this is a very instructive game, just from the standpoint that, you know, if we get into a queenless middle game that looks completely equal, the queens come up the board, there's no pawns in the center, both the pawns are on the flanks, and it's nearly completely symmetrical. But in a span of like 15 or so moves, I managed to completely outplay my FIDE master opponent. And why is that? It's because, you know, there's a lot of maneuvering left in the game. Just because, you know, a position is equal does not mean it's a draw. And I really hope you all can take this to heart in your own games, because it's a super, super important concept to understand that coordination is paramount. And if you have good coordination, unprotected pieces, and you just kind of, you know, think about those elements, you can start to loosen the screws. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.